On a cold but sunny January afternoon, my dog Stormy and I set out on a bike ride to traverse part of a dike called the Waterlandse Zeedijk, which has stood here at the edge of Amsterdam and beyond for almost 1,000 years. To one side of it is what used to be the sea. There's still water there, but it has long since been tamed by multiple dams within and outside of Amsterdam. On the other side of the dike are the different neighborhoods of Amsterdam Noord and the villages and farms of the area called Waterland or Waterland. Nowadays, the dike itself is an island of expensive and quaint houses in the middle of the relatively modern rest of Amsterdam Noord. Calm village living within a 15-minute bike ride of Amsterdam city centre. Not even 100 years ago, however, this dike was the only defense against the main enemy of the 200 or so square kilometers of land that lay behind it: water. While it was generally effective at its job, it did frequently break in different places. These dike breaches were often disastrous for the inhabitants of this area, like the villages of Nieuwendam, Watersnood and Schellingwoude, which would later go on to become Amsterdam Noord. Homes were destroyed, land was flooded, and parts of the land were often literally lost to the sea. For the city of Amsterdam, however, these floods had other, maybe more unexpected consequences. Our journey today starts at the western edge of the Nieuwendammer Dijk, somewhat in the middle of the part of the Waterlandse Zeedijk that runs through Amsterdam Noord. Almost all of Amsterdam Noord is inside of the historical region of Waterland, as we say in Dutch, or as I will refer to it to not confuse myself with pronunciations, Waterland. The story of Waterland begins somewhere near the end of the first millennium CE. It was a peat swamp or bog about 4 meters above sea level. As far as we know, there had been little to no human activity in this area for a very long time. Mostly because this swampy area was quite overgrown and wet and therefore very difficult to access by land. Most habitation in the general region up until then was along the dune edges at the North Sea to the west and north of Amsterdam. At some point around 900 CE, farmland began to run out along the dunes, and the proto-Dutchies living there got on their proto-boats and began navigating down the rivers that ran through the bog in search of more space. To make this space usable for farming, they applied a process which in Dutch we call ontginnen. I am not quite sure on the direct translation, but the basic process is that of draining the soil of its water by digging ditches through the land perpendicular to the existing rivers and then extracting the peat. The drained soil could now sustain certain types of grain, and the parts that were still too wet were used for cattle and other animals. The ditches that were dug, aside from being used for drainage of course, were also useful for demarcating property lines. Interestingly, these 1,000-year-old property lines, or at least this pattern of ditches perpendicular to streams and rivers, can still be seen quite clearly today. As we're making our way across the Nieuwendammer Dijk and are approaching the next part of the dike that runs through the village of Schellingwoude, we get closer to the drained farmland. Draining the land was the perfect and probably only solution for the proto-Dutchies in need of farmland, but in hindsight, it was far from perfect. Everything you see here used to be 4 meters above sea level, but comparing the water level to the right with the level of the land to the left, it is easy to see that that is not the case today. Nowadays, most of the area is between 1 and 7 meters below sea level, because, as it turns out, draining peat of its water makes the soil unstable, causing it to drop in height. Estimates are an average loss of height of about 1 centimeter per year or 1 meter per century. So if we do some quick math, assuming that the first proto-Dutchies arrived around 900 CE, that would mean that around 1300 CE, the land would have dropped 4 meters to around sea level. And indeed, in the first 3 centuries of the second millennium, the ground sank and sank. The rivers stopped flowing, and in the deepest parts of Waterland, lakes even started to form, such as the Buikslotermeer. Waterland had turned from a peat bog into an archipelago of sorts, with many tiny islands. In fact, it is only around this time that the name Waterland started to be used for the region at all. Around the same time, a different development occurred in the Dutch land and waterscape, a bit further north. Over the course of about 100 years between 1150 and 1250, multiple storms breached the peat bog and dunes surrounding the river that connected the lake Almere with the North Sea, turning this lake into an inland sea. This inland sea used to be called the Zuiderzee, or the Southern Sea. As we bike into the next village of Durgerdam, we ride next to what used to be this sea. The tides and storms were so heavy that the water carved away the peat all the way to the dunes in the west along the riverbanks of the IJ, the body of water between Amsterdam and Waterland. What was first a small river between Proto-Amsterdam, which was now only a couple of streets, and Waterland, had turned into a 30-kilometer long arm of the Zuiderzee, subject to its tides and stormy conditions. The dropping soil of Waterland and the development of the Zuiderzee created the feud between Waterland and the water that lasted centuries and in some forms lasts up until today. Just imagine this: land below sea level, 1 to 7 meters, right next to an inland sea, in which the water level could rise 3 meters with the right storm conditions. It's a recipe for disaster. It is around this time, in the 12th century or so, that the then inhabitants of Waterland built the first provisional dike around the area to try to keep the water out, the Waterlandse Zeedijk, on which Stormy is captaining my bike today. Keeping the water out proved to be an impossible challenge. The now archipelago of Waterland was a mess of silted soil from this point forward. As the land had become silted and wet, it became unusable for growing crops and even unusable for keeping livestock. The Waterlanders mostly moved higher up to live on the dikes, for economic reasons and also because their previous homes were probably destroyed in one of the many floods that turned the area into a lake for months at a time. The inhabitants of Waterland slowly migrated from the lower land up onto the dike, building houses much like the ones we are now biking past. The economy of the villages in Waterland, such as Watersnood and Nieuwendam, shifted towards servicing Amsterdam. Waterlanders became seamen, shipbuilders, ferrymen, traders, fishermen, among many other things. For quite a few centuries, the people in Waterland lived like this, as the land behind the dike remained in a bad state due to constant flooding. With the dike in a permanently bad state, floods kept on occurring, such as in 1406, 1421, 1466, 1514, 1534, and so on and so on. The flood in 1421 actually wiped an entire village off of the map called Eidorn. It also broke the dike so badly that the entire plot of land that used to be around the village was exiled outside of the dike, as they had to rebuild the dike much further inland. There's currently an old lighthouse and restaurant as well as a nature reserve on the plot of land, which sits here next to the village of Durgerdam. The new villages on top of the dike and its inhabitants actually prospered quite well economically, despite the bad state of the dike and the land behind it. This economic prosperity ended at the end of the 16th century, when the area was used as a battlefield for a decade and the port of Amsterdam was blockaded at the same time, both as a result of the 80 Years' War. Around the same time as Waterland declined, due to being in the war and then being unable to bounce back from the war, Amsterdam and the Netherlands as a whole started to prosper. And with this prosperity came technological advancement, such as the windmill. In the 17th century, the land behind the dike in Waterland was drained again, though unlike the early Waterlanders 700 years before them, they were now able to drain even land below sea level by using wind power. This meant that the land behind the dike was finally suitable for livestock again and regained some of its value. This was the catalyst for Waterland getting back on track after the war, as they were now able to provide Amsterdam with milk, butter and other dairy products alongside their dike and sea-based activities. The drawback, however, was that the land sunk even further due to the windmill's drastic draining, and the land sinking meant that the dikes got even weaker and that floods became even more devastating. Take for example the Kinselmeer, next to which I stopped to take a stroll with Stormy on the dike, which is currently being renovated, hence its bare appearance. The Kinselmeer gets its name from two villages which used to be here, Grote and Kleine Kijnsel, or Big and Small Kijnsel. Both villages were basically bullied out of existence and claimed by the Zuiderzee in multiple floods over the centuries between 1500 and 1900. In the early 19th century, Napoleonic soldiers built a military dam right on this spot. This military dam served well as a defense post against people, but not so much against water. The dike broke here and created such a big lake that while the dam was rebuilt in largely the same spot, it was decided to not drain the lake as it was basically not worth the effort. While the Kinselmeer was a reminder of how powerful floods still were, everything that could go wrong came together in a spectacularly devastating disaster in the winter of 1916. Weeks of heavy winds in southwestern direction in early January culminated in a massive storm on the 13th and 14th. Record high water levels were measured along the Zuiderzee banks on multiple occasions, going as high as 3 or even 4 meters above the regular height of the water. While the dike stands higher than that above the water, as of course you've been able to see, the prolonged heavy pressure of meters of extra water and wind on the still not too well maintained dike was something it could not withstand. And that brings us to the furthest point of my leisurely though cold bike ride. It is here, just north of the village of Oude, where one of the first breaches in the dike occurred, sometime in the night between January 13 and 14. While efforts were made to keep the water out, it could not be stopped. The dike was breached at many other places, 11 in total along its entire length. Water rushed into Waterland as the Zuiderzee emptied through the dike. The entire area was flooded, and after a few days the dikes around the inner polders, the lakes that were formed when the proto-Waterlanders drained the soil some 700 or 800 years ago, were also breached and the polders even flooded. This was of course a disaster for the inhabitants of Waterland. Most of those living behind the dike had to abandon their home, often leaving animals, valuables and their livelihood behind. In some cases, even sick or old family members had to be left behind. As the water rushed in, the 200 square kilometers of Waterland became one giant lake. Houses were flooded, destroyed, or in some cases swept away by the water in its entirety. Many people lost their lives, and certain areas, like the island of Marken just north of here, got hit hardest. There are many stories to tell about the floods and the weeks after, though today we will look at what the flood meant for Amsterdam. As Waterland was one of the main dairy suppliers of the now exploded in population Amsterdam of the 20th century, the area housed many cows. Most farmers spent the night of the flood and the days after trying to bring as many of their cows to a safe place. At first, all churches in the area were used as temporary animal shelters, as they were often built on slight mounds. But due to the water rising even further, and the churches having a limit on their tolerance of excrement and destruction in their holy house, another solution had to be found. And so, different organizations such as the Army, the Waterland Committee, the Amsterdam and Dutch governments got together to rally a plan to find temporary homes for the cows alongside their search for the temporary homes for the displaced people. These temporary homes for cows were found with farmers all throughout the country, often south of Amsterdam. And the fastest way for these cows to get there was to travel through Amsterdam, be it on foot or on boats. Now, supplying Amsterdam with dairy is not something done by a few cows. We should think more in the vicinity of tens of thousands of cows. Farmers could bring their cows to the Tolhuistuin, which is now where the main ferry over the IJ docks in Nood. After a few days, there was no more space, and a large empty field nearby that was used for big fairs was turned into a giant open-air barn. From these places, the cows were put on boats to cross the IJ to continue their journey into their temporary homes. So, while Waterland was flooded with water, as a direct result, Amsterdam was flooded with cows. Ironically, they were suffering from a dairy shortage at the same time. There was not much time to milk the cows that were being transported, and they did not give much milk either due to a lack of food and stress. It took until the 23rd of March for all dike breaches around Waterland to be sealed and somewhat repaired, and many months more for the area to be drained again. Some of the cows that traversed Amsterdam were sold as the farmers needed the money to rebuild their life. Some 12,000 or so were sold to Germany for slaughter, as they had become too weak due to stress, and Germany had a shortage of meat due to World War I. The more fortunate cows were once again transported back to Waterland once the farm was back in use. In the years after this flood, the already proposed but not yet accepted plan to dam the Zuiderzee created by Mr. Lely was accepted by the government. In 1932, this dike was constructed, called the Afsluitdijk, which turned the Zuiderzee into a lake we now call the IJsselmeer. While this would not mean the end of devastating floods in the Netherlands, as 1953 saw a huge flood destroy parts of the southwest of the country, it would mean the end of floods of Waterland due to the Zuiderzee for now. Because, while a lake is much less dangerous than an open sea, Waterland remains multiple meters below sea level on average, right next to a big body of water. The dike is still very much important for the area in that regard, which is why it now receives proper maintenance, such as the maintenance that has been and is going on for a few years now. The municipalities of Nieuwendam, Buiksloot and Ransdorp were annexed by Amsterdam in 1921, as they had become riddled with debt and were unable to survive on their own after the flood. The villages with the same names, as well as the villages of Schellingwoude, Zunderdorp, Durgerdam and Holysloot, were now part of the municipality of Amsterdam. This annexed land, specifically that of Nieuwendam and Buiksloot, would be the ground on which most of Amsterdam Noord would be developed and built in the next century. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. This video was created over a period of many months, and along the way I taught myself the basics of Premiere and After Effects, so you will have seen the quality improve throughout the course of the video. I thought of going back and improving the first parts, but decided I had to stop somewhere or it would never see the light of day. If you enjoyed, feel free to subscribe and or give a like. I don't know if or when a next installment of A Ferry Across will be, but I guess you will have to wait and find out.